Beginning in Luke chapter 23, Luke writes this. It says, they also led 2 other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him, along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. They drew lots as a way of dividing up Jesus' clothing. It was now about noon, and darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock, while the sun stopped shining. And then the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle. Crying out with a loud voice, Jesus said, Father, into your hands I entrust my life. After he said this, Jesus breathed for the last time. When the centurion saw what was happening, he praised God, saying, it really is true. This man was righteous. All the crowds who had come together to see this event returned to their homes, beating their chests after seeing what happened. And everyone who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance observing these things. Now, very early in the morning, on the first day of the week, the women went to the tomb, bringing fragrant spices they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. They did not know what to make of this. Suddenly, 2 men were standing beside them, gleaming in bright clothing, and the women were frightened, and they bowed their faces towards the ground. But the men said to them, why do you look for the living among the dead? He isn't here, but has been raised. Remember what he told you while he was still in Galilee? That the one must be handed over to sinners, to be crucified, and on the 3rd day to arise again. Then they remembered Jesus' words. When they returned from the tomb, they reported all these things to the 11 and to the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women who told these things to the apostles. These words struck the apostles as nonsense, and they did not believe the women. But Peter ran to the tomb. When he bent over to look inside, he saw only the linen cloth. And then he too returned home, wondering what had happened. On that same day, 2 disciples were traveling to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about all these things that happened. And while they were discussing these things, Jesus himself arrived and joined them on their journey. But they were prevented from recognizing him. Jesus said to them, what are you talking about as you walk along? And they stopped with their faces downcast. The one, named Cleopas, replied, are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who is unaware of the things that have taken place here over the last few days? Jesus said to them, what things? They said to him, the things about Jesus of Nazareth. Because of his powerful deeds and words, he was recognized by God and all of the people as a prophet. But our chief priests and our leaders handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel. All of these things happened 3 days ago. But there's more. Some women from our group left us stunned. They went to the tomb early this morning and they did not find his body. They came to us saying they had even seen a vision of angels who told them that Jesus is alive. Some of these who were with us went to the tomb and they found things just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then Jesus said to them, you foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and then enter into his glory? And then Jesus interpreted for them the things written about himself in all the scriptures, starting with Moses and going through all the prophets. When they came to Emmaus, Jesus acted as if he was going to go ahead. But they urged him, saying, stay with us. It's nearly evening and the day is almost over. And so Jesus went in to stay with them. After he took his seat at the table with them, he took the bread. He blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. Their eyes were open and they recognized him, but Jesus disappeared from their sight. They said to each other, "Weren't our hearts on fire when he spoke to us along the road and when he explained the scriptures for us?" So they got up right then and returned to Jerusalem. They found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying to each other, "The Lord is risen. He has appeared to Simon." And then the two disciples described what happened along the road and how Jesus was made known to them as he broke the bread. Now, that's a lot. Sometimes we'll just read one verse and we'll try to unpack it. But this is the story. The story of death and fate, the story of resurrection and questions, the story of finding hope in the midst of doubt. And I wanted to read that entire story for you this morning to give you a sense of the flow of all of it, because it wasn't just this instant moment where the disciples saw everything and understood everything and all of a sudden the resurrection was clear to them. But they had to work through the questions of faith until they understood what it meant to rely on God for themselves. You see, as we get into this idea of relying on God, you realize that there's kind of two different parts to it. There's watching someone else rely on God. There's watching Jesus rely on God. And then there is relying on God ourselves. And we realize those two things are not the same. And so my hope for us today is we can look at Jesus and look at the trust Jesus shows us as he turned to God, as he faced death. And that we can then begin to embrace that level of relying on God ourselves. So, you've got some sermon notes in your bulletin. If that's helpful for you, I encourage you to follow along. There's some blanks you can fill in. If that's not helpful for you, you're welcome to make a paper airplane out of this later and see how well it flies. Your first sermon note, though, is this. Jesus declared that he relied on God with his final words. "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." He also showed that he relied on God through his willingness to face death, knowing that only God can defeat the grave. So it's one thing for us to say, "God, into you I entrust my life," but we actually have to live that out. It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to live it. And Jesus, by taking these words, these are actually words from the Psalms. So those of you who've been worshiping with us throughout Lent, we've been talking about the Psalms and how the Psalms shape us in our lives of faith. These are words from the Psalms. "Into your hands I entrust my life," or "I entrust my spirit." Jesus didn't just say it, but he lived it by not trying to get down from the cross himself, by not trying to fight, but by saying, "This is the path you are leading me down, God." And so, if we are to be people who truly rely on God, we can't just say to one another, "Hey, yeah, I have faith," or "Yeah, Jesus is my Lord." Our lives need to reflect that. And so, as you begin to process what does it mean to be an Easter person, I want you to be thinking about this. Does your life say the same thing that you're proclaiming with your words? If you're saying, "Jesus is my Lord," can someone look at your life and say, "Hey, that person is following Jesus. They're loving their neighbor. They're caring for the poor. They're watching for the people around them. They are people of prayer. They're people of worship." Our words and our lives, they have to match up. This is what Jesus said. He's on the cross here. The darkness covers the whole earth. And Jesus cries out, "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." And then he did it. He let go of his spirit. Because his reliance on God was that firm, that strong. And the amazing thing about this way that when our words and our lives line up together, all of a sudden the people around us start to look at us and say, "Hey, that person really does have faith. That person really does believe in Jesus," because Their lives match up with what they're saying. And you can see this in Jesus' life. And this is your next sermon note. By relying on God, even in death, Jesus even convinced the Roman soldiers that his faith was real. Real faith relies on God in ways that matter. So, the very next thing we see in the story is, I like this guy. I thought this guy was a good picture. We see the Roman centurion, who's the commander. If you think of the word century, it's from the same root. He's a commander over 100 soldiers. So the Roman centurion, who was in charge of this execution, saw Jesus' faith and saw the way his faith lined up with his actions and said, hey, this guy was a righteous man. This guy was a holy man. He didn't know who Jesus was. He didn't know that Jesus was the Son of God, but he recognized something in the way Jesus' faith, in his words, lined up with his faith in his actions. It is really true. This man was righteous. My hope is that people can look at our lives and say the same thing. They can hear the way we speak of our faith. And they can watch the way we live our faith, and they can say, that person is righteous. They're truly following God. They're living out this resurrection kind of faith. The beauty of the story, though, is it doesn't end here with the cross and Jesus' death. The story moves forward. And we see the women coming to the grave on that first Easter Sunday morning, early in the morning. They're coming to, they think, prepare a body, but there is no body. Instead, this whole new journey of what it means to follow a risen Lord starts by finding an empty tomb. Resurrection is the ultimate way that God showed how God shows up when we rely on God. This is your next sermon note. The resurrection. It's the ultimate example of how God works when we rely on God. There was a really dark time. For those of you who follow the calendar of Christian year, you know that we worshiped on Thursday, right? We had Holy Thursday or Maundy Thursday worship. And then we worshiped on Friday. We had Good Friday when the crucifixion happened. And yesterday is this silent day. There was nothing written about what happened on that Saturday. Nobody talks about it because it was just this time of waiting to see what God was going to do. And then God shows up. And then the resurrection happens. And then we see that Jesus' reliance on God bears out in life. It's the ultimate example of seeing how God works. Not immediately. Not in the time frame that we would have picked. But God works powerfully as we rely on God. The thing is, the disciples weren't the ones who were relying on God in this situation. It was Jesus. It was Jesus' faith. And so, as the disciples see this, they're kind of confused. They don't really know what to make of it. Because as far as they thought, Jesus had died, and Jesus was gone. And so, this is what they said. Luke writes this, he says, the disciples didn't know what to make of it. They see an empty tomb. I don't know what to think. Did somebody come and steal his body? Did he faint and wake up? And there's all sorts of theories about what could have happened. They didn't know what to think. The thing is, that's natural. When we're looking from the outside on God showing up in someone else's life. Now, how many of you have known someone who would say that they've had something miraculous happen in their lives? How many of y'all know somebody who said, something miraculous has happened in my life? There's a miraculous healing. Don't raise your hands. I'm not asking if it's happened to you. So you're safe here. No one's going to think you're weird. Somebody has said, God has shown up in a powerful way in my life. I suspect a lot of us, see some hands here. We know people who say that, and honestly, it's hard to know what to think about that. Because there's people who like to tell stories, there's people who like to embellish, there's coincidences, right? And it's hard to know what to say when someone else says, hey, God has done something powerful in my life. But it is completely different when we go from the outside to being on the inside. When we go from being the one who's watching God encounter someone else to the one in whose life God is working. Now, I'm not going to ask y'all to raise your hands, but I know some of you have some incredible stories of how God has met you. I actually just heard another one this morning. And it's one of those things you say, wow, this is incredible. And those things, they're going to change you. You might tell them the person sitting next to you and they say, yeah, maybe not. But they're going to change you. And so my hope for us as we think about what it means to rely on God is that we would go from being the spectators of God showing up in someone else's life to the people who are actually encountering God in our own lives because we are relying on God ourselves. This is what we saw with the women here, the last verse down here at the bottom. They see the empty tomb, they don't know what to make of it. Because God is showing up in Jesus' life, and they haven't encountered it yet for themselves. There's a lot of different things we can feel while we're waiting to see God show up in our lives. While we're waiting for that faith where we're relying on God, we're waiting for it to come to fruition. And some of the things we see here are despair. We see some confusion. We have Cleopas and this other disciple. They're walking down the road. They're on their way to Emmaus. They're leaving Jerusalem. I don't know if y'all caught that. Jerusalem is the place where you go to worship, where the disciples were gathering. They were leaving there. They were basically saying, I guess this is done. This whole following Jesus thing, I guess it's over. They were despairing. They were confused. And they needed to encounter God themselves. It was one thing to hear the story the women told, but they didn't know what to do with it because it wasn't yet personal. They're walking along. Jesus is talking with them. Look at this last line down here at the bottom, verse 21. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. You notice the past tense verb there? It's our grammar lesson for today. If something is in the past tense, that means it's past, right? They hoped that. They'd kind of given up that hope because Jesus had been crucified. And so in the midst of their despair and their confusion, Jesus himself shows up and walks with them and teaches them about all the things that the Scripture has said about how they're going to know who the Christ is, about all the things that the Christ is going to experience. But remarkably, even this teaching doesn't do anything for them. It doesn't open their eyes. And this is your next sermon up here. Teaching was not enough to open the disciples' eyes to see Jesus. They needed God's Spirit to work through broken bread. Now, this is something that honestly it took me a while to learn because I'm kind of a heady guy. I like to think that if I learn something, if something is taught to me, that will change me. But the reality is, just learning about Jesus, learning about what the Scriptures say, it's not the same as actually encountering God. It's actually having God show up and move in our lives. There are plenty of people who have been in Sunday school for years, who may have learned all sorts of things about God, but are still missing that personal encounter with a God who shows up when we rely on God, when we trust in God. The story goes on to talk about the broken bread. They were stopping for the night, and Jesus acted like he was going to continue. But they invited him to stay. They invited him to stop and be present with them in that place. And Luke tells us how Jesus took bread. And Jesus broke bread and gave it to them. And it was in receiving that broken bread that their eyes were opened. It wasn't a teaching. It wasn't somebody arguing them into the kingdom of God. It was God's Spirit showing up in broken bread. Now we're gonna celebrate communion later, and I just want to tell you this ahead of time. If you're not regularly here in worship, you're welcome to come and receive. You're welcome to not, if you don't feel comfortable. But we celebrate this meal because it is through broken bread that God's Spirit likes to show up in our lives and help us to see Jesus. And we all need that. No matter how many times we've been to Sunday school or been to church, no matter how many sermons we've heard or how many times we've read the Bible, we need God's Spirit to show up for us and help us to see Christ risen. So your final sermon note is this. It's only after they encounter Jesus and God's power becomes personal are the disciples able to understand the presence of God for those who rely on God. If you read on, the book of Luke is about to end, but the book of Acts is actually volume 2, written by the same guy. All of a sudden, these guys who couldn't get it are turning to God and relying on God, and God is showing up in their lives in powerful ways because this encounter with God has become personal. And so, my hope for us today is that we would consider that line that Jesus said as we on the cross, Lord, into your hands I commit my spirit. And the question I have is, whose hands are you trusting your life and your spirit to? Who are you going to rely on? If we're honest with ourselves, most of us, we tend to rely on ourselves. We tend to rely on, well, how can I take care of the problems in my life? How can I take care of my struggles? How can I take care of my finances? How can I take care of making sure I've got what I need or what I want? My question is, what would it look like if you truly relied on God? We're going to be exploring what that looks like more in the next few weeks, and I hope you all will be in worship with us for that. But today I want you to simply make a declaration. You received this when you came in. It's part of the bulletin. It says on one side, it says, into your hands, Lord, do I trust my spirit. Y'all got this? Go with me? Into your hands, Lord, do I trust my spirit. On the other side, it says, in my own hands do I trust my spirit. Now, I want you to be honest about this. Where are you trusting yourself? When we come forward for communion, there's one of these restaurant spikes here. You know the thing they stick your bill on and you paid it? Okay, it's kind of final. It's done. Figure out which side you're going to put this. You're going to rely on yourself, or are you going to make a commitment to try to rely on God? Now, that's not going to happen overnight, relying on God. But I hope you will enter that journey.